Morning, everybody. Welcome to your Rocktober event. Good morning, Marius. I'm sure we're going to see your wonderful face.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's almost the stretch that we need to push forward towards the end of the year. Congratulations to a lot of you. I see that you are absolutely killing it in a tough market. So well done. Super proud of you. Marius, once again, thank you so much for all your input every month. Your
Good
sessions are
pleasure. Yeah, thanks for
so
having me.
informative.
Yeah.
We love having you.
Right. Morning, everyone. Guys, so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover occupation clauses, and part of what made me think about occupation clauses was, I've been consulting quite a lot recently on subject to sales, dealing with occupation type issues, and it's to get the occupation clauses right is so important, and it's actually such an emotional issue. People feel aggrieved for a bunch of reasons, and I'll give you some examples as we go through the consequences of getting the clauses right. And even when you're not necessarily, you do everything you can, you still find that there's a potential problem that arises. And the other thing that made me think about occupational clauses is we're heading up towards December time period. So the deals that you start doing now in October, are going to be they're going to be on the cusp deals. So, if you think that your transfer is going to take roughly 8 to 10 weeks, maybe 12, depending on the terms of your agreement, it kind of takes us into that December period. And the December period is always it's always a little bit of a tough one. It's a tough one from the point of view that people don't want to move at the end of December. And we're having lots of requests already for deals that are coming in to say, guys, please don't register in December. Please register in the middle of January, which is a potential also not easy, or register at the end of January, which is a little bit better. But understanding that the occupation clauses, in some deals is very simple. You got a young buyer living with their parents, going to move into a property. They got no pressure from where they're coming from. But other times you got a seller who's a family and a buyer who's a family, and they need to make sure that when this transfer goes through, they can move out of their current premises by giving proper notice or transferring that property into the new premises. So it's all a case of timing up the actual physical occupation of the properties. And there's dogs and there's cats and there's spouses and there's children and there's schools and there's exams and there's all kinds of considerations that make actually moving house and moving into a new house in a very practical and stressful time. Also, bear in mind, what we sometimes don't see, especially as conveyancers, is you need to move house. You must sell some furniture. When do you sell the furniture? You want to, you need to start packing your house up. And if you get the occupation dates wrong, or people can't move in when they expect, they pack their house up, they've booked the removal vans. There's so many complexities that are just so practical. We have to be very practical about occupation clauses. So the purpose of the discussion today is to look at the various issues around occupation clauses, and to just start right at the top. In your standard occupation clause, it's going to say transfer of this property can be the occupation of the property is at noon on X time, right? So my personal preference, right? So let me start this way. You've got two choices. One is you can say occupation is on registration or transfer, being the date that the ownership of the property passes in the deeds office. Or B, you can say occupation is on a particular date. So my preference is always occupation on registration or transfer. It's just easier from a transfer point of view. It means to a large degree that when I transfer the property, the buyer hasn't moved in yet, which means that the buyer hasn't been able to move in and find all kinds of little problems in the house that he didn't see before, and then try and drag and stop my transfer from going forward by refusing to pay or sign documents until these issues are resolved. So occupational transfer is just easier to deal with. And that being said, it doesn't mean that further on in the process, we won't move occupational transfer to an addendum and move it to a particular date. But I think to start off with occupational transfer is probably easier. That said, it's not always possible. It's not always feasible. Sometimes your circumstances are such that you're going to have a particular date of transfer, and you're going to say occupational transfer of the property will be the 1st of December 2025 or the 1st of February 2026. To make the occupation date the 1st of January is always very difficult. And just while this is in my mind, just to talk about the deeds office closing, and when we talk about occupation dates and dates by when we're going to transfer, people always say to me, oh, but the deeds office closes for the whole of December, don't they? Or they close for a long time. The truth of the matter is the deeds office doesn't really close. The deeds office will shut down on the 24th, the day before Christmas, and depending on the configuration of that particular year, will reopen on the 27th, operate the 28th, 29th, and reopen on the first working day in January. That's the general trend. Sometimes if the configuration of weekends and public holidays is such that there's very few days between the 26th and the 1st, they might close for that period. But the deeds office doesn't really close. And contrary to expectation, in December, the deeds office is actually very efficient. And again, contrary to expectation, the deeds office is actually very efficient in January as well, because in January, we clear out the backlog. In December, the deeds office actually makes a plan to register all the matters that need to be registered. So the deeds office will actually say to us, guys, our closing date this year is X, and we'll be closed for these dates. If you want to register in December, you must have lodged by this date. So they, for example, will say, you must have lodged by the 2nd of December if you want to register your matter in December. So the deeds office is actually quite proactive in regard to dealing with a December closing. And a lot of people are under the impression that the deeds office takes, isn't it, they say to me, isn't the deeds office a month? And I say, no, the deeds office is the end of the process. It's actually 7 to 10 to 12 days, in total in the deeds office from lodgement to registration. It's relatively quick. The conveyancing process doesn't comprise, or just the deeds office comprises this whole thing. Anyway, that's that we digress very slightly. So the next thing I think you must take note of is we're going to amend the occupation date. So say, for example, we have an occupation date on registration or transfer, and as we get close to the transfer date, the parties decide, you know what, we're going to amend this and make it on a particular date, so it's convenient to move it at the end of a month, depending on parties' circumstances. So the first thing to note, guys, is that in all agreements, you have this no variation clause that says, this agreement shall not be varied or cancelled unless such variation and cancellation is reduced to writing and signed by the parties or duly authorized representatives. And then in my clause, it says the requirement is only satisfied if the amendment or variation is on written, paper-based form, and the provisions of the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act are expressly excluded from this clause. So what I'm really saying there is that you can't have a verbal agreement to amend the occupation date. The amendment to the occupation date must be reduced to writing and signed by the parties in wet ink. We want to exclude the provisions of the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act because I don't want people WhatsApping each other and emailing each other, and that is deemed to be an amendment of the date. So if you want to, I want the amendment of the date to be a very deliberate affair. So you can, at the bottom of the slide, you can see it's the sort of ideal clause. The parties agree occupation date contemplated in clause X. The principal agreement shall be amended from the date they set date therein to X date, right? So the first thing about amending the occupation date, A, it must be deliberate. 2, it must be reduced to writing and signed by the parties. And the reason why I wanted to be deliberate, and we've seen this happen before, the parties discuss amongst each other, and they discuss with the property practitioner an amended date, and they all agree verbally, and we all decide we're going to go ahead with that verbal date. But we are then told about the date a few days before the actual date. So, for example, we'll be told on the 25th of October that the parties have agreed to move on the 1st of November. And then we'll call the parties and say, great, well, how are we paying occupation rent, et cetera, et cetera. And what we've seen before is people change their minds. They say, sorry, I'm not going to move anymore. So the buyer will say, sorry, my circumstances changed, I'm not going to move. I realize that I can't get out of my lease agreement. But now the seller has packed up their house. The seller's paid for a removal company. The seller's now got the entire house in boxes. They've paid for a new lease to go live somewhere else. And now the buyer sees they're not moving. And now Murphy's Law is we have a delay in the transfer of the property. It creates pandemonium because it's very hard now to enforce that verbal agreement to amend the occupation date. So my point is, let's be deliberate about amending the occupation date. Let's control it very closely, and let's have a definitive date that's set and agreed to the parties in writing that we can kind of hold the parties to and create certainty. The third issue is in your agreement, it says the occupational rent shall be the sum of. Now, the first thing in my mind is that whether you're going to have occupation on transfer, whether you've got a specific date of occupation, my suggestion is that you write in that occupational rent in the clause regardless. And the reason why we write the occupational rent amount into the clause regardless of what the date of occupation is because if it's on transfer and later we decide that we're going to make occupation on a particular date, we now don't need to renegotiate the occupational rent. It's in the agreement. So it's one less thing we must get the parties to agree to. The second thing is how much occupational rent. My view is you must talk to your rental colleagues and find a market-related occupational rent and then use that as your occupational rent. Don't be tempted to go for a rule of thumb rate of 1% or a rule of thumb rate of 0.5% or 0.75%. Because if I'm transferring a 10 million rand property, 1% of the purchase price is way too high for occupational rent. You know, those high-end properties, the rentals are lower. It's probably more in the region of 0.4, maybe 0.5, maybe 0.6%. If I'm selling a million rand property, the correct occupational rent on a market-related basis is probably about 0.7%, maybe 0.75%. But don't prejudge it. Find a market-related rent that's fair to both parties. Also, don't be tempted to sort of work out the occupational rent based on, for example, what the seller's current costs are. So you say, well, the sellers, we sell property for 5 million rand, but the seller's outstanding bond is 2 million rand, and the levies and rates and taxes are X. So we say, right, let's make an occupational rent 25,000 rand a month. Because when we have a non-market related occupational rent and the transfer is delayed, okay, one party finds it beneficial to either get occupational rent or pay occupational rent, depends if it's high or low, and then you find the parties going to dispute because there's dissatisfaction. So if the seller gets a very low occupational rent and the transfer is delayed, for example, because of rates and taxes or something like that, over an extended period of time, the seller is receiving less value for their property what they ought to receive, and it results in them being very, very unhappy. So we want to try and have a market-related rent. The next thing about the occupational rent clause is that we need to make sure that our clauses are very, very clear as to who is liable to make payment of electricity and water during the period of occupation. And I've actually seen clauses in agents' agreements where it doesn't stipulate. So it'll say occupational rent is the sum of 15,000 rand per month. It doesn't say the person in occupation of the property is liable to make payment of the water and electricity consumed in respect to the property. It doesn't say that. It got no detail. In that particular case I'm thinking of, the agent and the seller made an assumption that, well, it's customary. It's customary that the buyer is going to pay the water and electricity consumed, because that's only fair. But in this case, the buyer said, no, the contract doesn't say that. We have a written agreement. In the absence of something to the contrary, we're bound by the written agreement. The written agreement doesn't say I'm liable for electricity and water, so I'm not. And it's a lot of money. If you're living in a high-end property, 6, 7, 8 million rand, your electricity and water and your rates and taxes, your electricity and water could come to 10,000 rand a month. So if the guy's in the property for 10 months, for 5 months, it's like 50,000 rand. And that's why it's so important. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions around liability for the payment of electricity and water, liability for the payment of levies and rates and taxes. Make sure it's clearly stipulated in your agreement so that we can avoid these kinds of disputes. Remember, contracts are there to create certainty, and therefore we want to have absolute certainty in regard to these particular issues. If there's going to be a delayed transfer date, right? So let's say you enter into an agreement now and the parties say, listen, my children are writing exams, We're going away on holiday in December. We don't want to take transfer the property now. We only want transfer on the 1st of February next year, or on the 1st of March next year. Please write it into a contract. The parties instruct the conveyancing attorneys to effect registration or transfer as close as possible to X date, or as close as possible to the date of occupation, or we instruct or notwithstanding a delayed occupation date, we instruct the parties to effect transfers close in the ordinary course of events. Because what we find is that when, for example, there's an occupation date of the 1st of March next year, and the parties then tend to decide what's best for them, and then they start disagreeing on whether we transfer close as possible occupation date or whether we transfer in the ordinary course. Sometimes the buyer says to us, no, transfer the property right now and let that seller pay me occupational rent. And the seller goes, I'm not paying occupational rent. I don't have a bond. Therefore, I'm going to wait occupation date. And now we have this dispute between the parties, which is very simply avoided by a very simple clause instructing the conveyancers what to do. Don't underestimate the ability of people to fight, argue, bitch, and moan about what they want and create pressure on the parties. I'm involved in a transaction now where the natural date of transfer of the property is the end of October. The seller tells me he's moving to Cape Town, so he doesn't want to move out before the end of November, and he has a penalty on his penalty interest on his bond, so he doesn't want to lose the money, and he's not going to move out. The buyer just said, "Oh, they're cancelling the agreement," because the buyer wants transfer in the beginning of November to effect renovations, November before December closing, so he can have a tenant the property on the 1st of January. The problem here is that, and it's not necessarily it's not the property practitioner's fault, but the seller got the impression from the agents involved that an average transfer is 3 months. I think we need to be very careful about saying to people a transfer will be 3 months, because it may not be 3 months. In this particular case, if you look at the time periods in the agreement, it wasn't a suspensive. It was suspensive upon the buyer selling his property within 45 days, which he sold a lot earlier, and that. So my deal was on the 25th of August. I take the suspensive period and the guarantee period, and it takes me till about the 5th of October. So that transfer should be registered in October. So it's kind of September, October. I'm doing probably a fair transfer on that matter is probably about 8 weeks. So we must be careful to give people dates, because people plan according to those dates. It's the same as when people come in to sign documents here, and I have my attorney sign. I say, guys, please don't promise when occupation will be or when we're going to transfer by. We need to look at the file very deliberately and before we kind of make that decision. Please also remember that if you're going to have a scenario where we have a date of occupation next year, March, but we agree that we're going to transfer the property now, remind your seller that your seller is going to pay occupational rent once the property is transferred, because the seller is not going to live in a property which he doesn't own. Somebody else owns it. And we've had cases where sellers are flabbergasted that we're asking them to pay occupational rent in their property. And we must explain to them that, yes, you no longer own the property. You've got your proceeds of sale. You're not liable for rates and taxes. You're not liable for bond, and therefore you can. It's not your property. So this is just an example of a clause, and guys, please remember my property law manual. I've got all these ideal clauses that you can lean on if you need to draft clauses. But this is just a clause that deals with the fact that the seller is going to remain occupation. So if I get a transfer in and I'm not going to agree the seller is going to remain occupation, so until a particular date. So I'm going to transfer the property now in October, and the buyer will remain in occupation until, say, for example, the 1st of March. I make provision for the payment of electricity, water, who's going to pay rates and taxes, who's going to pay occupational rent. So please, guys, you can rely on some of these clauses to assist you, or give me a call. Guys, always please remember that when dealing with occupation clauses, if you're going to have occupation prior to transfer, so you do a deal now, and you're going to give the buyer occupation on the 1st of November, right? Remember that we can't give occupation until all the suspensive conditions are fulfilled. So don't enter into an agreement now where you're giving the buyer 30 days to get a bond until the 15th of November, but you're giving the buyer occupation on the 1st of November. Because the problem there is obvious. The buyer moves in on the 1st of October, of November, and then doesn't get his bond, and our deal lapses. Now, what do we have? We have a buy and occupation and no agreement. And please don't underestimate the ability of people to lie, cheat, and steal and get in the property and not pay occupational rent and then squat. Guys, it absolutely happens. And do not be the property practitioner that gets caught with their pants down in that kind of scenario. Best practice is that it's a cash deal. I want the cash in the account. Bond deal, the bond must be granted. So, for example, you could have a clause that looks something like this, right? This is also manual. And this clause basically says, Mr. Buyer, you can occupy the property if, 1, you pay the deposit. 2, your bond has been granted. 3, all suspensive conditions have been fulfilled. You paid the cost of transfer and transfer and bond costs. You signed bond and transfer documents. You've given all the parties their FICA documents, and you've paid the occupational rent. Once you've done that, Mr. Buyer, you can occupy the property. If you don't do that, the seller has the right to refuse occupation, but you're still liable for occupational rent. So and these clauses can be used so nicely, because sometimes what these clauses do, they enable us to have a motivated purchaser who expedites what they need to do because they're motivated to go into the property. The next thing that I want to talk about in terms of occupation clauses is what happens if we're not going to give vacant occupation because there's a tenant in the property, right? So now we're going to give occupation on registration or transfer subject to the existing tenant's rights. In this case, guys, we've got to get the lease agreement. So remember that the hier gaat voor koop principle applies. And what that principle means is that the lease trumps the sale. I'm a tenant, I'm living in the property, you sell the property, it doesn't affect my lease agreement. I have the right to remain in the property regardless of whether you sold the property or not. Only thing that happens is on registration or transfer, the buyer steps into the shoes of the seller as the landlord, and I continue to pay my rent. So if we're going to take over the tenant, ergo, what we need to do is get a copy of the lease agreement, go through the lease agreement, give the lease agreement to the seller, make sure they sign for it, or there's a read receipt if you email it, but make sure the seller's got a copy of the lease agreement, make sure that they understand what it is that they're taking over, the duration of the lease, the rental, the terms of the lease agreement, etc., etc. And we also want to have an addendum which provides for us as conveyancers to, on registration or transfer, pay the pro rata rental for the month and the deposit over to the seller, right? That's what we want. So we want to have it nice and neatly. We want this whole thing to be tied up. We want to make sure that, because guys, if we don't have these clauses, right, post-registration or transfer, we haven't paid the seller the buyer the pro rata rent, and we haven't paid the buyer the deposit, the tenant's deposit, and now the buyer calls us. Where's my deposit? Where's my occupational rent? Now we must try and convince the seller to release the money. We know what's happened. The seller spent the deposit. All landlords who are not in managed scenario spend the deposit, right? They swing it. Now let's get the guy to go and pay. Much easier for me to do it as a conveyancer from proceeds of sale. What happens if there's no lease agreement? What happens if the parties say, listen, there's no lease agreement? Well, then what we must do is we must get the parties to simply, so we will ask the seller and the tenant to write down the terms of their lease in very simple point format, right? Get the tenant to sign it, get the landlord to sign it, and then we give that to the buyer so we can agree what are the terms of this lease agreement, because the buyer needs to understand what is he taking over. The next clause is the property is occupied by a tenant, but we're going to allow, but the buyer wants to occupy the property personally. So in other words, we must get rid of the tenant. Occupation is on registration or transfer. And remember, your clause will read, the seller shall be obliged to provide vacant occupation to the purchaser on registration or transfer. Again, this is rinse repeat of my previous slide. We must get a copy of the lease agreement. We must look at the lease agreement, and we must determine how long does this lease last. Is it a fixed term lease that runs until August next year? Is it on a month-by-month basis? If it's a fixed-term lease, does the landlord have the right to give the tenant notice? Because there's no point in us doing a sale now where a buyer has an expectation of transfer and occupation in 8 weeks, but the tenant has the right to live in the property for the next 10 months. Then we must rather take that lease agreement, we must draw an addendum to the lease agreement, get the buyer to agree that he's going to be, we're allowed to cancel the lease agreement, and the buyer and the tenant's going to vacate. And even then, guys, so that's wrapping it up nice and neatly, right? Even then, what we're going to find is we're going to find that there are certain buyers who are going to say, oh, I'm not comfortable with that. Because I've heard so many stories from my friends and colleagues, horror stories that they took transfer of a property and the tenant refused to move out. So I have what I call a comfort clause. And the comfort clause is an addendum that you put to your agreement. It basically says the party record the property is occupied by tenants, the purchaser is entitled to vacant occupation, the seller warrants the tenant the property shall vacated prior to registration. And here's the kicker part that gives the buyer the comfort. The conveyancing attorneys are instructed by the parties not to register the transfer in the deeds office until the purchaser and agent have confirmed in writing that to the attorneys that the tenant has vacated the property. So in other words, what we're doing here is we're having a scenario where we will lodge towards the end of the month. We'll try and come up on prep right about the last day of the month. The tenant moves out on the last day or the first day of the month. Once we know the tenant is out, we then register, and that avoids the scenario where the buyer is stuck with a scenario where the tenant won't move out. Guys, just a word of caution here, what we have experienced from time to time is that you have a husband and wife, they're married, they're getting divorced. Property is in wife's name, and now she signs the offer to purchase. Husband refuses to move until he gets his settlement money. We've actually seen this. It's a problem. We need to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We all understand what are we doing, when are these guys going to vacate, how will the husband vacate, and to the largest degree possible, we need to try and control the circumstances because we don't want unhappy clients. And remember, guys, this whole approach, right? This whole approach of looking very deliberately at occupation clauses and understanding the ramifications and the potential pitfalls of occupation clauses and getting them right is all about having a smooth transfer. You want to list the property, have a successful marketing, find the buyer, conclude the sale, have a smooth transfer process, smooth key handover, give the guy his gift, everyone's happy. We don't want disputes and fights. And while I'm thinking about this, guys, I do see some agreements saying sometimes we have clauses which create confusion. So we have a clause that says the seller shall be obliged to give vacant occupation to the purchaser on date of registration or transfer, or earlier, or at an earlier date if agreed to by the parties. Now, that creates confusion because people don't understand what that clause means. Does it mean sometimes buyers take that to mean, well, occupations on transfer, or if I tell everybody, then occupation is earlier. But it doesn't work that way. I need agreement. So try not to have additional writing that confuses the issue, because remember, we're dealing with lay people and they don't understand how it works. They don't, you talking to them, but it doesn't always compute for them exactly like you understand it, because you have done this 100 times. This is the first time they're doing it. My last couple of points here, guys, is subject to sales. Please look at the two agreements and tie up the occupation dates, or make them register on the same day, but don't have subject to sales where there's different occupation date. And this is difficult sometimes because you're not in control of everything, right? You're not in control of sometimes it's you're not doing both sales. There's somebody else doing the other sale. And guys, my last point is, and this relates to occupation, because remember the clause says you can't make any changes to the property prior to registration or transfer. What I'm saying to you is when you have that call from the buyer saying, you know what, I want to make changes, you say, please wait. please just wait. Don't complicate my life. Don't complicate your life. Just wait until the property is yours and do it. If it becomes a deal breaker, then let's attack it more deliberately. Well, what do you want to do? I want to change the carpets. I want to repaint this. I want to do this. I want to put security. I'll put electric fence. Okay, let's have an addendum that records that. Or no, I want to break down walls and I want to demolish this and that. No, sorry, guys, we can't go into that kind of stuff. So again, there's an exception to every single rule, but my point is approach it carefully. Please talk to us about helping with clauses and addendums. You know, what seems like such a simple clause, a few sentences, really, I think, needs to be understood a lot more depth, and thought must be given to your transaction as a totality in order to avoid the disputes, and in order to have smooth, effective transfers where our clients are happy and they go forward and share what a wonderful experience they had with us, and they tell all their friends to buy and sell their property through us and us alone. Guys, that's my pearls of wisdom for the morning. I hope that was useful to you guys. I don't see any questions, so I take it that I hope that means it was self-explanatory. I hope that gives you guys some insights into my experience with these clauses.
Thanks, Marius. Very interesting. Actually, somebody requested this training, so I think we're going to send your recording out to the rest of the group. It obviously is an issue at the moment. So I think you're not the only one who's battling with it. But thank you. Extremely insightful as always.
Cool, brilliant, guys. Have a great rest of your session, and good luck for the month of October.